Welcome to another episode of Consumer Engagement in an Omnichannel World. Our co-hosts, Shri Rajagopalan and Peter V.S. Bond, explore how brands and retailers engage with consumers in store, online, and everywhere in between. And now, here are Shri and Peter.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Consumer Engagement in an Omnichannel World. I'm your co-host Shri, along with Peter. And I want to remind everyone before we get started today that you can catch all our information on linktr.ee/CPGGUYS. And you can find our podcast on all the podcasting platforms, Apple included, tinyurl.com/Apple CPG podcast. Today is an exceptionally special day because we have a very special guest. Before we do that, Peter.
Shri, I know I'm beaming because my team, the Dodgers, are undefeated and in first place. And what's more, I know that they've scored twice as many runs as the Yankees have this year. But let's put that aside. I always love spending time with you. You're the Batman to my Robin, the Bartles to my James, the Sonny to my Cher. It's great to be with you, Shri.
And I'll be his enemy and Beelzebub himself when the Yankees take the season from the Dodgers. So we'll come back to that. Of course, we had a second at-bat home run, which the Dodgers didn't have from Stanton. So that said, let me welcome our special guest today. Now, I have actually worked for this person back at Johnson & Johnson, a mentor of mine and the former consumer group chairman of North America for Johnson & Johnson. Jeff Smith, who is now moved from what I would call was a marketing leader, a brand curator, and a actual general manager and running the consumer group for Johnson & Johnson into DTC, startups, and the world of incubating products all from scratch. So Jeff, if you can please tell us who you are for the audience.
First off, thank you both for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited to be here, and I know you guys are doing some great things. I won't jump into the baseball fight because I've got nothing to fight with, so going hatless, and we'll go from there. But I'll start with a little bit of a background on my career. As Shri mentioned, longtime Johnson & Johnson employee. I came out of school and went to Procter & Gamble in my early days of sales and marketing, and then after about 5 years, switched over to Johnson & Johnson, and had always intended to become an entrepreneur after about 4 or 5 years of working in Johnson & Johnson. Unfortunately, 29 and a bit years later, I realized that I was still there and had had a great career with a great company. So one never wants to end something when it's fantastic, and I certainly had a great time. And you stay for 29 years because it is exciting, and you do love what you do. But as you mentioned, most recently, I grew up in sort of sales and marketing, local and global marketing, and most recently was for the last 4 years of my career as company group chairman for the consumer business across all of North America and all the businesses, and took the opportunity to fulfill that passion that I always had for entrepreneurship, and took a retirement out when I could, and left last May of 2019, and have been deep in launching startups ever since.
So I'm actually thrilled that you chose to stay 29 years, because at the latter end of those 29 years, our paths crossed. And if you had chosen to go into the entrepreneur world a long time ago, I don't know if our paths would have crossed. So, but I think it was meant. Yeah. It was like meant to be. So just like the Yankees.
There you go.
Just like the Yankee season in 2020. So Jeff, the first thing that kind of comes to my mind as we discuss, 29-year career in Johnson & Johnson, there can't be a more stable, larger, kind of well-organized, taken for granted company than Johnson & Johnson with the scale that it has. And now you are in the world of several startups. They're focused on the consumer, like one-on-one relationships. They're D2C based. Like, how does one make a change and evolve from that very large, stable ecosystem to baptism by fire every single day?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I get that asked a lot. I mean, I think I was fortunate in my career. When I came out and went to P&G, I came to, probably is one of the largest, most well-known consumer packaged goods brand company at the time, right? So this is late 80s, early 90s. And, I needed that discipline. I needed that structure coming into a big company at that point. The reason I, left and was attracted by what Johnson & Johnson offered is, the management philosophy of J&J was a very decentralized, let the markets run their businesses. They know their consumer the best. They know how to innovate for what their markets need. And so I joined a company that was built on a reputation of high degree of entrepreneurship and a high degree of decentralization. And I think that decentralization, when people say, how did you stay 29 years? Because it always felt like I was running my own company. So the transition, the deep pockets, the passion for winning with the consumer, those types of things were always in the big company and are probably the hallmarks of becoming an entrepreneur. And outside of having the deep pockets, I find it very similar jumping over, a little bit faster, obviously faster paced, less decision making, less bureaucracy, but the transition hasn't really been what I would call I left from one world that was completely different to another. They had a lot of things that were meshed together that make them both exciting places to have worked.
Jeff, thanks for that. And it's such a pleasure to be able to speak with you today. It's always good to see a fellow Canadian make it big in the world. And congratulations on the success of
Hey, wait, Peter, I didn't know you're Canadian. That's something new I discovered about Peter all the time.
I have to leave a little mystery in our relationship. But in any event, looking back to your J&J days, having been there through 29 and a half years, as you mentioned, it's the early 90s, and along comes AOL, and then all of a sudden people are online, and then along comes 1985, and here's Amazon selling books out of Seattle. I'm kind of curious whether it was for you an evolution or whether there was some kind of catalyst or a pivot moment where it kind of hit you that, wow, this online e-commerce digital situation, it could be something really big and we need to invest against this. What was it from your experience that kind of moved you in that direction?
Yeah, no, I think it's very critical to think about in the context of what went on from, I'll call it the 2009, 2010 timeframe. I think, post that was an incredible opportunity for new business models, new disruptive approaches to driving the consumer engagement forward. Probably not unlike, we'll talk a little later maybe, but not unlike, I think, what's going to happen over the next few years. And, big companies at that time, I think, embraced it. They said all the right things. They provided money to the right places. We hired lots of talent. Sri was one of those in the middle part of that decade. And a lot of good ideas got all the way to launch and then never got the funding. And I think, big companies want to do it. They want to get there, and they're constrained by a P&L environment that requires them to continue to deliver, to meet either, if you're a public company, Wall Street requirements. If you're not a public company, then meeting investor requirements. And it kept tripping up what was so many of the ideas we saw succeeding from founders and not, entrepreneurs were ideas that we could have easily have executed in some ways, but didn't take them all the way through. And therefore didn't have, the passion to see it all the way to the end. Arguably, that might be changing given what has gone on most recently. But I think it's still a challenging environment in a large company to take the resources, mostly financial, and move them over to something that's going to be high growth, low profit at the beginning, but a big part of the future of their brands. And that was really the catalyst. I saw the opportunity. I kept seeing it. And finally, it was like, I want to go participate in this, and I want to do it and show that it can be done. And to do that, I had to step outside of the four walls of the big CPG company.
Great. Thank you.
Jeff, speaking of catalyst of change, earlier you did say, while the roles are radically different between a large company and what you do today, they're also remarkably similar in the sense many things translate over. But I would love to know, Jeff, the Jeff Smith that was Consumer Group chairman back at J&J and the Jeff Smith that is now in Venture Studios and Paragon Vitamins, like what does a day in the life of Jeff Smith look like now from morning to evening, and how radically different is that from the Johnson & Johnson days?
Well, I could probably say I've never worked harder.
You and me both.
I never enjoyed it more, though, so there's another part of that. Yeah, never enjoyed it more either, which I feel like I'm 30 years old all over again. So that's great. Again, I had a great career, and there was lots of things I loved about it. But you start to feel like you're on a bit of a in a rut, or you're kind of doing the same thing every day in some ways. And the entrepreneurial world is highly fascinating, from the ability to be as high as making some of the big decisions and doing some of the things to literally being a practitioner. I clearly, over the last 15 years of my career, was not a practitioner. I mean, when I mean a practitioner, I'm placing ads, I'm buying on Facebook, I've got my own ARS account, and I'm looking at my domain ratings and looking for ways to build my keywords up. I mean, company group chairmen of big companies that are $7 billion in sales don't do that. And that's a skill I had to learn all over again. And there's nobody to point. Well, every time I pointed, nobody, took the ball and ran with it. So I figured I had to do it myself. So, so it's both the fascinating part of it and the exciting part of it. But it's also the scary part of it when you realize, how little of a practitioner I was and how much of a overseer of work I'd become in my old role. And so that is what, gets me up every day at 5 o'clock, and, why you're still going at midnight sometimes when you're trying to get a website to go live.
And Jeff, I can totally relate to what you're saying. As we launch ZenFuel now, it's like literally when I think of running a campaign now, I had to start my own Seller Central account on Amazon, which back in the J&J days, you and I both, if you remember, we took a trip to meet Andrew at Pharma Packs, and that's how we did 3P. Yep. So it's so radically different. I totally relate to you. Totally. While you are your own boss, you're also accountable for everything. And that's the Jeff Smith said today, I guess.
I can add to that. When I launched this,
I found my results didn't improve. My results didn't improve on SEO if I didn't actually do something about it.
Yeah. When Shri and I decided to launch this venture together, I had to teach myself how to use iMovie, edit clips, videos. I needed to understand Audacity and sound management, how to push podcasts onto 15 sites. So amen. It's learning, but it's what keeps us growing.
We agreed early up front that I would dress up, look pretty, and speak English with an accent.
We're working on that. So when I thinking about your time at J&J and even at Paragon, the role of innovation in consumer packaged goods has changed in an omni-channel world. So I'm kind of curious from your perspective, in today's environment, is it more about just pushing out as much innovation as possible? It's about the quantity and just testing and learning, or is it taking the time to build a really high quality product before you take it to market? What's kind of the yin and yang?
I think the former can be done. I mean, I'm not sure it's necessarily the success model. I think there will be some successes, not that it can't be done, but they're, 1 in 1,000 that you hit that in some ways. To some degree, it's a big reason why my partner, Josh Geim, who was former head of R&D at Johnson & Johnson for almost 15 years, and I created the Ignite Venture Studio. So, the Ignite Venture Studio premise isn't just to be a typical venture studio and create new brands or disruptive, segments of business model growth. It's really one. What we tried to figure out is like, what is it going to look like going forward? And this is 2018. Late 2018 that we're thinking about this. So, you put that in context of, what was happening with many of the startups. They were being fueled by big venture-backed cash infusions. They were chasing customer growth. Many of them, had trouble or difficulty describing the path to profitability. And we when we were working at J&J had seen so many acquisitions of many of these startups when they came in, and the big difficulty a big company had swallowing these up and transforming them was many of the processes, many of the approaches to formulation, to compliance, to regulatory paths, and that had been marginalized. That a lot of what had to be done was sort of an internal reset of the company to meet the standards of a J&J. And in the 24 months that you might do all that, growth would disappear because you would get so internally focused on transforming formulations and manufacturing sites and compliance and everything else. And so the premise of Ignite was we would partner with large CPG companies first and foremost. We always have a partner before we launch. Prior to that, we go out and validate ideas. We go out and validate business models. We build a brand. We get a marketing playbook. We create the supply chain. We do all the regulatory path work, set up manufacturing. And then work with the partner to take an investment. We often will put in language around a version of a right of first negotiation or refusal or whatever you want to call that, and work with them going forward from there to raise more money to launch the product and drive it. And so, what the advantage in some ways is for the large company is that we've done all the work with partners. We have investors like Lubrizol, a Berkshire Hathaway company, et cetera, that are, doing a lot of that formulation work. They do a lot of work for the big CPGs. We make sure that all the, I's are dotted and T's are crossed as a big company would want, so that we're truly doing a build to buy model that if they do decide that it's sustainable, it's growing, it meets their need for scale, and they do decide to transact on it, they can easily digest it and put it inside in their organization without having to do a bunch of, rework and activity. And we generally set up a joint strategic steering committee with them that they have a seat on, so that they can see the growth and the data as we build it out. And so it's a little bit different model than I'll call it a pure founder-led. Build it and eventually sell it. We probably hit more, staying with the baseball analogies, probably hitting more doubles if we're successful, not as many home runs, but a much more clear path to delivering it.
So Jeff, speaking of that very delivery, a career that spans Procter & Gamble and Johnson & Johnson before becoming a startup founder and owner. Obviously, you were responsible for delivering many things, such as the quarterly EBITDA, eventually managing brand equity for just a microcosm, this like megacosm of brands, if there was such a word, across multiple subcategories. And then people was another big part of that. And earlier you talked about the transformation to digital, omni-channel, e-commerce, things of that nature. If you look back those 29 years plus P&G, what would you say was one of those toughest, or I would say an opportunity moment in the industry that you encountered, that you found was profound for the industry, that you had to overcome for the brands you represented?
Probably by far the biggest. I mean, I saw obviously lots of up and downs from like the early '90s through till 2019. So it's, by no stretch was that just like a period of growth. And there were some great ones in there when, the expansion of the hypermarket, facility created, millions of square, footage of linear space that needed innovation to fill it up. But, big companies rode that because they were, pretty strong with the Walmarts and the Targets and CVSs of the world. So, those are great days in some ways. But, every good story also has its valleys. And, I think the massive amount of entrepreneurship that went on post the 2010, 2011 downturn created, a unique environment that is driven big companies to be scared of competing in growth, if you will. They're constantly trying to find their path forward. They're protecting the big brands. You got all these little ones that are nipping at the heels to shut them down. And so the toughest part was just management of people and expectations. People want to work at places that are fun and exciting and interesting and driving growth. And when they see their big companies not really delivering on that, they get concerned about that. And you have to manage the employee group to deliver that in a way that is sustainable for their families and their careers. And so that's the part that really pulls at the heartstrings and the mind to make you worry about all the people that work for you and the context of managing growth at the same time. And so that was always the toughest challenge, is just the whole people aspect when you got thousands of people working for you.
Fair enough.
That's great, Jeff. So now, when we think about people who are in the business of innovating, I don't care if it's a innovation brand manager at a big CPG or someone working out of their garage, given the fact that we live in a very digital world today, what would be your advice on successfully incubating a brand? What are kind of a couple of the key things they just really need to be focused on to ensure a greater likelihood of success?
There's some big things, like I'll call it, really figure out your unit economics, understand, what it takes to make money. This idea that if you just build something that loses a bunch of money now, and that eventually, if you get to hundreds of millions of dollars in sales, that it'll, magically turn profitable, is not really true. You have to understand your unit economics from the start. And that doesn't mean you're going to make money from the start, but at least you understand how to make money in the context. Everything else, I think, is like, make decisions and move. There's no fixed decision in this that requires your inability to change 2 weeks from now if you learn something new. So it's, take all your best ideas, put them into the mind, into the aspect of what you're launching, and then go and figure out, and iterate on your proposition, because it's highly unlikely with what you start with is going to be what you end up being successful with. It's going to change. It's going to morph into things that you hadn't originally thought of. The consumer is going to drive you to places that are more lucrative and have bigger volumes. And when you do that, you end up with a much better proposition. So it's, don't overthink it. I see too many people jump out and get into businesses, and they take over a year to get an idea to the marketplace, when they would have got a lot more learning if they'd just gone 9 months earlier and used the experience as their learning model to grow it out from and get real life experience.
Brilliant.
Fair enough, Jeff. That very statement that people need to evolve with time takes me to my favorite topic, which is brands, media, and the world of brand equity.
Oh, don't get him started on media. Oh, no.
So clearly the world of brand equity building and preservation today is nothing like the brand equity building and preservation of yesterday. I say that from a macro lens, not necessarily from a micro lens, because many of the brand things that go into a brand's DNA really haven't changed even today. And to achieve scale, there's still only one format where you can achieve scale in the CPG industry today. But if you're a CMO today, your competition is no longer a peer that's equally large as you or maybe half your size, and you're not really competing for shelf space. You're competing with hundreds of small brands that collectively are accounting for 70, 80% of the growth of the category you may be competing in year over year. What is keeping that in mind as a backdrop, Jeff, since you've been a CMO multiple times in your life and have led brand equity development so many times, what is that big piece of advice you'll give the CMO of today who's competing in fast-moving consumer goods? How should they look at brand equity development and the industry in general?
Yeah, I don't, my general take is that too many startups don't think about that in the early stage. They think they'll build brand equity over time and then decide that what their brand is. I think you have to, be very, strategic and smart on, no different than a big company on really, getting that brand equity down pat, knowing your positioning, understanding the marketing playbook that is required. And I think the trick in some ways is that you have to think about it over a 5-year period of time. I think many DTC startups think about it in the context of DTC. And then they get down the road and they realize DTC is only going to be so big, and that they need to think about the omni-channel experience, and they didn't make that part of their, original brand equity work. So I think you have to really map it out for a longer period of time. That doesn't mean you have to be omni-channel in year 1 or year 2, but your brand has to be able to withstand the fact that you're going to need the flywheel from both the online first-party data as well as some type of an experience, whether that's traditional brick and mortar going to retailers, whether that's your own stores in some cases for some brands, creating your own brick and mortar experience shops, or even some level of, affiliate marketing or affiliate selling, that allows you to build out your own ecosystem of sales folks. So if you don't think about that from the beginning, you're going to end up with, in your brand equity work, you're going to end up with a brand that, is constantly trying to figure out what its equity is. So as much discipline as you can put into it at the beginning, it'll pay out in terms of, your output years down the road, but you won't have to rework it at that point.
Jeff, these are exactly some of the things we're noodling with at ZenFuel and trying to build like the 5-year roadmap. Focus on equity versus the e-commerce transactability part, which, like you said, leads D2C brands. But what if I flipped this and said, now go back to your older hat of yours, Jeff, preferably not the Dodgers, the Yankees, because it's 27 would always be the one I'd recommend. But if you wore that hat and you're now the CMO of a large company, which you have been many times in your life, what would you tell them differently? Because they are no longer in a world where they can simply take for granted they can incubate a brand because they have a relationship with the Walmart and it's a done deal. Hey, even NACDS looks like something in history these days.
Yeah. First and foremost, it's like stop acting like or saying that you're going to, e-commerce is a priority and, we're going to put, resources against it and we're going to hire some people. Like you need to get out, you need to do stuff. And they have the big budgets and they have the capabilities to withstand a couple of failures here and there. But if you don't go do something and get the skills into the people that work in your company, it's a really hard turnaround. You look at them, a company like Clorox, I think did a fantastic job of building the muscles well in advance of, the current pandemic. They would not have survived, I'll call it the e-commerce onslaught, had they not been experimenting months and years in advance. And I think that work, if you're running a big company today, you got to stop talking about it and you got to start doing it. And I think there's been too much talk. And I think many of them realized when their business started to, go into a state of trouble and they couldn't figure out, how to operate, that the investments they should have been making hadn't been made. And there's no, people use all kinds of, examples of things like, 2030 has been pulled forward to 2020 and there's charts of hockey stick. And sure. That's the obvious. But it was obvious 5 years ago. So you really didn't need the pandemic to prove to you that, e-commerce was going to be the future. And I think it's always fascinating how many people lead big companies who get, 10, 15 deliveries every month from Amazon, but yet aren't sure about e-commerce. It makes me laugh that it's kind of like, well, you live in a world where you're doing it, but you don't know if your company should be doing it. It's a little bit of a fascinating twist on, running a big company.
I think by now it's pretty clear why I loved working for Jeff.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, a PSA to our audience. Speaking of Clorox, if you still need wipes, just stand in front of your Target store at 8 a.m. and the minute the doors open, go right to the back where they're stocked. There's going to be a case on the top of the shelf. That's your opportunity. All right, personal experience. That being said, let's it works. Let's shift from the marketing to the sales side of things, because that's kind of my expertise. If you're a big scale brand, does D2C make sense? And how should I be thinking about that? Because sometimes these big brands are thinking, no, I don't need to do that. I let my retailers and their omni-channel strategy guide my capability. I'd love to know what advice you would give to big scale brands about should they experiment with D2C, B2B, whatever.
Yeah, so one, I think it's absolutely, check needs to be done. Living in a world where you're going to let these other companies dictate how you do it. And there's some great business to be done with, the Amazons and the Walmart.coms and the Target.coms and whatever. No reason why you're not going to do that. But I think, to win in the future, they're going to need to build those skills inside their own organization. You can't just rely on other organizations to drive your growth. And so for me, that means, like, if you're a large brand, pick I'll take an old brand of mine that, like a Neutrogena, at Johnson & Johnson, either find segments that you want to go into, that you haven't launched and they're difficult to get into retail, and do it on that. Use your brand in a new segment that you're either not competing in or have a really small position in, and go do that on the edge of the big brand. Or, at the same time, there's no reason why you can't innovate with the master brand to create, business models that are either subscription-based if you want to, build basket size, or even that use, tools of personalization or other activities that would allow you to create a more one-to-one engagement with a consumer, because that becomes a big part of your market research. It helps you formulate and ideate around new ideas and new products. But it puts you, because it really becomes the ability to understand what your core consumer wants and needs from you as a brand. And that's the reason to do it. And there's always going to be a revenue and a profit piece that comes along with it. But if you do it solely for that reason, you're not going to get there.
So stop talking, just go do it. There's a whole purpose behind why D2C chase it, but it's like performance with purpose. Don't just go start D2C because it's fun or because the next person or your peer chooses to do it, but performance with purpose, right? One of the areas that obviously hunkers down on moving to omnichannel, again, if you look at media over the years, we were able to successfully do this at Johnson & Johnson, which is as media changed from offline to online formats, went over to YouTube, Google, now streaming TV, etc. One of the areas that has really come up these days and is resulting in above the line, below the line fights in the industry on CPG P&Ls, which we also chatted with Brian Gildenberg, the Chief Commerce Officer for Omnicom, a few weeks ago. And there's AMG, there's Roundel from Target, and the Walmart has its own media group. CVS and Walgreens now announced their own. Everyone and everybody from HEB, Maya, everyone's going independent. This is creating nightmare for agencies to manage across the board because the number of people they have to work with is just blown out of proportion. But not every one of these is also born equal. They don't have the equal amount of eyeballs, but depending on if you're a super regional, you do for that region. What does a CMO do in a marketing mix here, Jeff? Because it doesn't look like anymore go forward, especially what happened in the last 3-4 months. Retail media is no longer an option. I know we conquered that at J&J, but the industry largely hasn't.
Yeah, and I think it's only going to get tougher. It is splitting budgets in dramatic ways, and I think obviously the retailer has incredible power over your brand when it sits in hundreds of thousands of doors. They expect, as they're building these tools and building these capabilities, they expect that you will support them like they've seen you do with a startup like an Amazon or whatever. And I think the agencies are trying to adapt as fast as possible, but always don't. They say they have the answers and they say they can manage. Don't always. I mean, they're learning it live. They're at the same time. So first and foremost, I think. Really, if you have an agency, pressure them to make sure that they're evolving their workforce and their capabilities, because it's it's going to change on them. Or if you don't have a current agency or you're looking for a new agency, you need to find, I'll call it new world agencies, the VaynerMedias of the world that grew up in that space. They don't have legacy and historic activities in old line businesses. They're very much a new line type of media company.
All right, Jeff. Hey, thanks. This is great. I'm going to finish this off with one last question. For all those would-be entrepreneurs that might be sitting inside a big company or sitting at home and always dream of, I don't know, necessarily being on Shark Tank, but certainly starting their own business, what sage advice would you have for them?
As I think about it, it always sound like I work for Nike, but I always use this: just do it, just get out and go do
Jeff,
it.
that is the mantra for this episode: is just do it.
He's going to be hashtagging that all over social media.
But you get, that's where the learning happens. I mean, when I was standing up Paragon Vitamins with some friends and my daughter, but there's so many things that you think that are going to be the way it happens until you put it into marketplace and operate in a stealth mode with friends and family as your customers. That's where you get all the real learning, and you take that and you can build it. You can put it into a model. We didn't start spending money until we had real feedback from hundreds of customers, and things that we thought were going to be true turned out to not necessarily be true. Some were, others were complete surprises, and you take that and you iterate and you move forward. And I don't think if you spend the time trying to figure it out without reality setting in, you're going to take twice as long or 5 times as long, and then you're going to find out the reality anyhow. So you just have to be adaptable, go and do it, take it on, don't worry about failure. They're not all going to work out, but from failure, you figure out exactly what you should have done and you execute it the next time. So there's too much just sitting. I think part of it is I find that as I maybe got older, I realized that there's no better time to do it than do it right now. Like there's no reason to wait for something. There's no big thing going to happen that's going to make it such that the opportunity is better today or better in the future than it is today. The best time to start with something is to start it today.
Great. Thank you, Jeff.
That is awesome. The mantras that we're going to take away from today are stop talking and just do it, and stealth mode, which hopefully, Jeff, we can have you come back at a later time and talk to us about stealth mode. But as I close this episode out, I want to thank you, Jeff, for sharing multiple decades of your wisdom in the CPG industry and curating many a brand, you name it, over time, and sharing that with our audience, what it takes and how personally you've evolved and how the industry has evolved as well. And, personal thank you from my side, which I heartfully pass on to you, Jeff, which is I feel the years I spent at Johnson & Johnson under your leadership was where I really grew up in the industry and and you gave me the leeway to go experiment and do things that traditionally a large company would have been very difficult to do, especially as I had come over from a PepsiCo. And I remember you even telling me once upon a time, after we had gone through the interview process, et cetera, that you found something different in me because your ideal dream candidate of coming and leading e-commerce wasn't someone that was selling potato chips in a previous life, coming over to beauty, skincare, et cetera. So I genuinely want to thank you. And I'm not so sure I personally would have started up ZenFuel, a DTC brand, if I hadn't gone through those experiences. But a sincere thank you, and you're always welcome back on the show anytime you want to, Jeff, and we'll discuss stealth mode when you're back. Peter, thank you very much for doing this week over week, and the man himself, the CRM captain, the data captain, and the consumer captain, Mr. Peter Bond. And for all our viewers and listeners, a reminder, you can catch this episode on YouTube as well on the CPG e-commerce channel. You can catch it on the Apple podcast, where we'd love for you to rate us as well as like us on tinyurl.com/Apple CPG podcast. And you can find all our content on linktr.ee, linktr.ee/CPG guys. With that, thank you, and we'll catch you again very soon on the next episode.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
The content in this podcast episode is provided for general informational purposes only. By listening to our episode, you understand that no information contained in this episode should be construed as advice from CPG Guys LLC or the individual author, hosts, or guests, nor is it intended to be a substitute for research on any subject matter. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by CPG Guys LLC. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. The views expressed by CPG Guys LLC do not represent the views of their employers or the entity they represent. CPG Guys LLC expressly disclaims any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, consequential, or other damages arising out of any individual's use of, reference to, or inability to use this podcast or the information we present in this podcast.